housing costs, where I assume our large bulge has helped to drive up housing costs here, which is creating something of a problem for younger people. Yeah. And to the extent that we mature and leave this earth, there will be fewer people competing for those houses, and it may indeed help the younger population.
I wonder how that's going to happen in different parts of the world, though.
Sure.
What that dynamic will be. Let's take a question now from the Pontificia Universidad in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and we look forward to your question.
Considering that the economic impact is baby boomers, caused by baby boomers, ¿podría repetir la pregunta, por favor? Okay. Considering that the baby boomers are the people responsible for the economic impact, what is the optimal level of equilibrium and balance that you recommend for human resources of the baby boomers and the newer generations? What is the level, the balance point?
Well, tough question. Good question, but a tough question. From a business perspective, I'd come to Charles, I think, first on this one, if you've got some thoughts.
I think that's probably as individual cultural organizations. But I am one who believes that a certain amount of sort of creative tension in an organization is very good. In fact, I know some organizations that always hire in pairs, for example, seeking to get that kind of creative abrasion that they feel results in good decision making.
Okay, good. Susan?
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I wouldn't try to tell you a number, a ratio. You need to look at the needs of each individual organization. If you're dealing, for instance, primarily with older people as your clients or the people you serve, you'll want more older workers probably. So it's just going to depend.
Okay, very good. Thanks to both of you for that. We're going now to the Universidad de Sonora in Hermosillo, Sonora, and your question, please.
Mexico. Good morning. This is a greeting from the University of Sonora, Mexico. First of all, I'd like to thank Susan Mitchell for a wonderful presentation and for giving us an insight to our social and human aspects of our generation. Frankly, this has been very enlightening to be able to recognize, identify, and to live all these things that she's described in her presentation. My comment and question have to do with the fact whether or not in some way the baby boomer generation has influenced in the preceding generations. And if it has also influenced on the adult generation, obviously the higher end of the boomer generation, the older one, may have to worry. And here is the question. Will they have to worry about the dynamics and the way in which it's going to unfold, or how they're going to develop and mature, so that when they become the adult generation?
The preceding generation. Let's take that piece first.
Yeah, that piece I probably understood a little better. I think I love the question because we didn't touch on this, but it's certainly true that the baby boom has influenced their elders. In a number of ways, the generation has helped older adults change their attitudes. It hasn't been conflict all the time. And I noticed coming here that I was flying on an airplane, and I know when I was a child, older adults dressed up to go on airplanes. And I noticed a lot of older Generation A men and women wearing blue jeans and T-shirts. And that literally, although it's a minor thing, it is a manifestation of that influence of the boomer, not just on younger generations, but on older generations as well. And that's absolutely the case. As for them getting older, I think, the boomers will do fine for the most part. I think it will be hard for us to fully accept being older, so what we'll have to do is just redefine what that means.
Older is getting older.
No, older is now no longer getting older. It was, and now we're going to define it as just another stage of youth
Okay,
in some
all right,
fashion.
that works.
So-
That works for
better.
me.
You're getting better, right.
Okay,
That's-
very good. Let's go now to the Universidad Ricardo Palma, excuse me, in Lima, Peru.
Muy buenos días. Los saluda Cecilia Alegría, directora del
Cecilia
Centro de
Alegría, I
Perfeccionamiento
direct the
Profesional de la Universidad Ricardo
training
Palma
center at the
de Lima,
University
Perú.
Palma
Primero, los
in
felicito
Peru.
por la calidad
Thank
de
you
las
very much for the
expositoras y de los
quality of
contenidos
the
vertidos hasta el
experts
momento.
and
Me
their contents.
interesaría que profundicen un poco más
I would
en el
love to have you
perfil
elaborate a little more on the
psicológico de los
profile,
baby
the
boomers,
psychological
y que nos
profile of the baby
expliquen
boomers. And if you
cuáles
could
serían
explain
las
what would be
principales
the
características de su
main
personalidad
features
que las
of their
nuevas
personality
generaciones, las de los
that the
jóvenes
new
entre 18 y
generations,
25 años,
that's
por
between
ejemplo,
18 and 25-year-olds, are
pues
actually
dado el
imitating
indiscutible
because
éxito de los baby boomers
they,
como
seeing as they see the baby boomers as a
suponemos que se
successful
constituye
generation,
en
they
una generación modelo,
suppose
digna
they
de ser
take them
imitada
for a
por la
model
gente.
generation that
Estamos
is
atentos a
worthy
la
of
respuesta. Muchas
imitation. So what would you think? What would you say about this?
Let's move to the personality mimicking piece of that question.
I don't know that the younger generations are consciously imitating the baby boom so much as they've been defined within a culture that created both the baby boom and them. The two characteristics I think are most important would be their independence and their individualism. By independence, I also mean that sort of anti-authoritarian component that says, you know, I'm skeptical of just accepting someone's authority at its face. I want you to prove it. I want to be a partner. And the individualism that says, I'm going to define every situation for me personally. I'm going to shape it. I'm going to make it mine. And I think those have the greatest influence both in and out of the workplace. And those are two characteristics which are carried on through Generation X, the younger generation, the what we call the N generation, the teenagers, and even into the generation that follows them, I think.
Thank you, Susan. Very good question. Silvesteria Cuauhtémoc Moctezuma in Monterrey, in Mexico, has our next question, please.
Sí, buenos días. Nosotros aquí en la compañía estamos
Here
muy
in our
preocupados
company, in the
temas de
brewing
los,
company,
los valores
we are worried about
tenemos que
values
vivir y
that
irnos
we
formando a través del tiempo y
expect
de
to
de
live,
la misma
to abide
cultura
by
organizacional. Y
in
bueno,
this organizational structure.
los baby boomers
Based
y a la-
on the baby
a la
boomer
mentalidad que han ido
generation and the
desarrollando,
mentality and
independentista,
idiosyncrasies that
aquí
they have
concluimos
developed,
que,
in other
bueno,
words, that they're very
la generación ha
independent,
llegado a una
we have
extrema
concluded that
enajenación
this
material
generation
y a
has
una
reached a
adopción de
certain
vicios que han
peak
permeado
in
unos
technology and also that has adopted a lot of vices. And we see that in the U.S. they have also created some anti-values concepts. And so that's what the United States has gained from all this. What do you think the impact of, the social impact of these anti-values of the baby boomers will have in the other generations? We in Mexico are very concerned that they will have a lot of influence and some tendencies that we're beginning to see worldwide, and we are not very happy. What do you think about all the bad things that are contagious to the rest of the world?
Anti-values, Charles.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. I'm not sure exactly what anti-values are. I sense maybe that means a different set of values. And I think it's only fair to say that we do see some of that wherever we look, and perhaps our generation is responsible for that. I think there's a level of commercialism, certainly in our culture, and that one sees reverberating around the world that has probably originated here. At the same time, I think there is a sense that the way we've always done things in business or politics or whatever has not provided all the answers. A friend of mine is very active in an organization called Business for Social Responsibility, which is an international group that seeks to bring large businesses on board to address things that have specifically to do with values, corporate values, cultural values, and political values. So I think at least here my sense is that when things appear to swing far in one direction, that there's a correcting force that arises.
And there are some people out there trying to help create that balance, help
Yes.
manage that balance.
Yes.
Very good. Let's go to Codatel in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic for our next question.
Buenos días.
Nuestra pregunta es la siguiente.
Our question is the
¿Cuál
following.
sería su recomendación
What would you
para los
recommend
baby
for
boomers
baby boomers
quienes, a pesar de
who,
mantenerse actualizados,
despite
están siendo sustituidos por jóvenes
keeping up
bien
to
preparados,
date, are being
basados en
replaced
el
by
sector económico?
very well prepared
Gracias.
younger generation, younger people? And what is their economic role?
Susan, I'm going to come back to you on this one, the kind of the replacement strategy or mandate, if you will.
I think that there are two things that boomers can do. One is I do work with companies that have very heavy boomer workforces, many boomers in them, and a lot of them do fear that these younger people with better skills will replace them. And one of the things I tell them is that you must take responsibility yourself for making sure that your skills remain upgraded. And this is why programs like this, the ITC program, are vital to keeping your skills and keeping your workforce upgraded. But beyond that, you have to ask yourself, is this what you really want to do? If you're failing to keep up with the technology, it may be because it's not what you're interested in anymore. And often when people get older, they do look for new opportunities in different settings. And I think people can do both those things, stay upgraded and look around to see what else you might be interested in.
Super question, super response, and thank you very much, both of you, for those answers, and to all of you for your questions. Let's now move on to the second module of our program, in which Susan will highlight some characteristics of the baby boomer generation through an interview with Charles Reilly.
Good morning. We're here this morning with Charles Reilly. Charles is the president of his own company, a public relations and marketing venture that he began some years ago. Charles is going to talk with me about the baby boom generation and some of the things we've been discussing this morning. Hi, Charles.
Good morning. It's nice to be
Welcome.
here. Thank you.
You told me some interesting things about your history. I know you've been in business for a long time. We're talking about the age structure of the population this morning and how large and small generations impact business and commerce. And I wondered if you want to share with us some of your observations about how that changing age structure affects business.
Sure. Well, I could think of a couple of things just with clients with whom I now consult. One is an architecture firm, for example, that does a lot of what's called public architecture. These would be schools, city halls, recreational centers, senior centers, and so on. And it's very important for them to understand where demographic changes are taking place, where schools will be constructed, for example, in younger communities, growing communities, and in our metropolitan area, San Diego, generally in outlying areas. At the same time, we, in looking at the population data, noted that one urgent need, perhaps not being addressed currently, will be the need for more senior facilities, which our generation will be looking to in a few years.
Right.
We have possibly, because we're Southern California and have been primarily a youth culture, have focused more on schools and education, forgive me, rather than upon the other end of the pyramid, but that soon is approaching.
And you find already that people are becoming aware of the need to address middle-aged and older populations after years of being very youth-oriented. Is that
I think in some segments that's true. Another client is in the healthcare and home care industry, and they are far more acutely aware of it because most healthcare services are indeed consumed by older people. And as our big bulge in the age population moves north on that population tree, we will need to have many more medical services available. I think it's not generally true in the culture, is my observation, but at least not in Southern California.
Well, we're still very youth-oriented. I think that's certainly one of the impacts the baby boom has had on society is that we maintain that youthful outlook, and we make sure that the rest of the population does as well. You do, as we mentioned, you have your own company and you're in public relations and marketing. And do you have any advice for people as they have to address this changing age structure? I think we mentioned earlier in our program that all nations at some point will find that the population in one age group or another has gotten larger or smaller. And do they need to respond to that? I mean, is that something in marketing you need to look at and address?
Yeah, absolutely, I think. And as to how to do it, I guess there are many ways, and that depends on individual. A couple of things that have helped me, I think. One, having had at least a brief excursion through demographics in college, a study in population and so on, which has given me some interest in reading about stories on trends and so on. Also, I have at one stop in my career very early on been a journalist, and so a lot is written about trends in some of our major newspapers, which has helped as well. And then a third thing, I think, is something, again, I learned as a reporter. You go knock on doors, and you can't really do that in the sense I could perhaps 20 years ago and walk into people's living rooms and say, I'm a reporter, and kind of what's your life like. But I think what I'm saying is that it's important to try to be aware and to make connections with people individually, because one can only ingest a certain amount by reading and looking at actuarial tables and so on.
But I think you make two excellent points, which is that people need to keep up with the demographic trends. One of the great success stories was when, I believe it was the Gerber Company, looked at the demographics. They actually looked at the number of babies being born, and they saw during the beginning of the baby boom that, in fact, the number kept going up, and they said, wow, let's increase production, let's increase marketing, let's be ready. And they were enormously successful. So following the trends. And then the other point I think you make, which is excellent, is that you need to talk to individuals.
Sure.
It's one thing to look at whole populations. It's also important to get out and actually get to know the people that you're targeting, working with, marketing to. Let's talk a little bit about you. You are somewhat typical of the baby boom. I know, for instance, you told me that you've been in a number of different businesses, that you've had a number of career changes along the way. Did you do that because you can't hold a job? I don't think so. But it seems typical, that need to change and reinvent yourself and looking for new opportunities. You know.
I think that the various things I've done all share sort of marketing and I guess motivation, sales, and so on. But it has come in several packages, including public relations and advertising on the one hand, including fundraising on the other, asking people to contribute to causes and so on. Simply perhaps a different transaction using some of the same skills. But I think also part of it has had to do with just family changes. At one point, I left a career in advertising in Los Angeles and moved to San Diego, concurrent with a spouse who was starting a career here. And That might not have been possible, say, for our parents' generation.
Or they may not have considered that appropriate. I think, you know,
Indeed.
that's a big difference, that sort of more equal career balance between men and women, that your career is not necessarily the most important in the family. You know, my career might be more important in my family, so that there's more of a balance. And that's certainly a sea change from previous generations.
I think we looked at that very pragmatically. I had a skill that was relatively transportable, marketing. My spouse was an academic in a fairly arcane area which could be practiced in only a few locales. So that was the trade-off that we made.
And people probably should no longer make an assumption that within a family, especially with the boomers and younger generations, that the man's career interests, whatever, will be the primary focus. That people should understand that a woman's career may in fact be more important sometimes than the man's. And that's a difference in how you approach people in general, not just in business, but in society and politics and every other way. That change is probably one of the most dominant ones in terms of how boomers look at the world.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the more interesting things about the boomer generations. We do have a somewhat different outlook. You and I have touched on the fact that we are forever young. You're never going to be old, right? You're not old now. You know, and I always say that we become old, that the age at which I'm old is 10 years older than I am now. So,
that's right.
And it will remain that way for all of us, right?
For others to judge. I guess
that's right.
My wife is fond of saying we don't get old, we only get more so. Right?
There you go. And I think those are differences. How does that play out, though, in terms of, for instance, in the workplace? You and I have talked about a little bit about you having your own company and having been through a lot of different work situations. So you've been able to observe the sort of environment that we find ourselves in. I know our outlook is youthful, but at the same time, we are now relatively middle-aged. We're often in management or professional positions. And do we find that there's some conflict there with younger workers, or is it all smooth, or do we have to work to help people navigate having different generations in the workplace?
I'm sure that's true, particularly in larger organizations. My organization is relatively small, and yet I do sort of get hints of that and have at various points. I think I have early in my career caused a certain amount of grief for those people supervising me, because I sensed things were moving too slowly and there were many more things that could be being done that weren't done, and in perhaps a very traditional organization was told, sort of patted on the back and said, now, we don't do it that way here. At the same time, I think I have also been in the position where I have sensed that I was the brake on other people's ambitions. And indeed, one of the things I hope I learned in going back to school and learning about management was that sense that in supervising people, it's very important to give them responsibility and give them an area in which they can thrive and, in fact, challenge if that's the case. And that ultimately, although there may be some friction that comes from that, the organization is healthier, the ideas are much richer and better thought out. Now,
you're saying that while you know there's some resistance on your part, you're also open to changing and to being receptive to the ideas of younger workers.
Try to be. Really all workers, but...
Right, but younger ones, because they come into the workplace typically full of new ideas and ready to change things and make them what they imagine to be better. Do you think that's a change since way back when? Do you think that businesses used to be more run from generation to generation, sort of this is how we do things? Have the boomers created a big difference in that sense since we've entered the workplace?
Absolutely. And I think that is visible in everything from our largest corporations, the General Motors, to the smallest corporations. And some of the clients I work with and do retreats and so on, that is always an issue. The younger people having a sense that reticence from those of my generation who run the company are not quite with it, or a little too slow, or, as often happens, I think, a sense of retaining power. And it's not that anybody consciously sets out to do that, but there's a sense that the work isn't really ready to go out the door until I've looked at it and given it my blessing, and sometimes that can slow things down.
Yes.
And so we try to work to set up other kinds of arrangements, or even communication styles between people at various levels, to try to free that up and keep that moving so that it doesn't become a source of friction, lack of productivity.
And I know I've found in working with corporations, businesses, government agencies, that boomer managers are receptive to looking at their own behavior, looking at how they might be, as you mentioned, the block to change. And I think that's one of the pluses, and people need to know that you can manage change in the workplace. You don't have to let it run away with you. You don't have to be wholly resistant to it.
Right.
You can find a way by working with your employees to educate and navigate change as new generations come into the workplace. Now, you mentioned a minute ago that one of the ways you learned to look at things that way and to do that was by going back to school.
Yes.
And this is not, when you say this, you don't mean you were 2 years out of college and said, I'm going back to school. You meant you went back to school fairly recently, later in life.
Yes.
And this is another interesting aspect of the baby boom, is this commitment to lifelong learning. What would prompt you to do that after many years in the workforce? You're established, you're working, and now to sort of drop it all and go into school again seems like a big change.
Yeah. It was, and it was concurrent with other changes going on in my life, but probably there were two things. A certain amount of pragmatism, but I hope a certain amount of wisdom and sort of learning as well. The pragmatism was, I found that in marketing, many of the positions that I might look to move to were being held by younger people who were far better at, say, computers and computer technology than I was. And so it was clear that I needed some retooling in that area. The second thing, I think, wisdom, going to school to get a management degree, I'd always envisioned as some sort of horrific and unpleasant number crunching exercise. And did I really want to spend my life adding up columns of figures and finding out how to get the last basis point in a negotiation, which I didn't. But really about 3/4 of it proved to be human behavior in some form or other, which of course is the basic grist of marketing. It's how people think about things, how people form their preferences, how you structure organizations so that you can encourage the very best from people, and all those things. Had I thought of it that way or known that earlier, I might have taken the plunge earlier.
But obviously, I think there was a time when people felt that when they had concluded their education, that was it, and now you went on to a different part of life.
Right.
But what I see in you and what I see in myself and many other boomers is that we see no end to education, that it continues for life. Do you feel that even now, I know you mentioned reading something about trends, about, it sounds to me as if you continue to educate yourself, even informally, on a regular basis.
Try to. We have in Southern California, as I suppose elsewhere, sort of a thriving university extension program. San Diego State has a terrific one. The University of California system has a terrific one. A couple of years ago, I took my first art class ever, something that had escaped me in college. My wife is an art professional, and I have always had some passing interest in it, but really no sort of structural knowledge.
Right.
And so that was an opportunity to
Right.
jump back in.